Babylon is a series that begins as a political and legal thriller, but gradually becomes something more unsettling. A thought experiment on self-termination, shaped by ethical, legal, and political commentary, ready to stretch our understanding of death itself. Initially, it appears to ask whether ending one's life can ever be justified as an individual choice. But the more I watched, the more I wondered about what kind of society makes such an act appear persuasive, liberating, or even politically legitimate. This essay does not approach Babylon primarily as an anime to be reviewed. I treat it instead as a starting point, a fictional vessel through which broader anxieties about death, freedom, legal authority, and social disintegration all become visible. My central argument is that the true horror of Babylon is not that Ai Magase is evil and makes people die. It is that the society depicted can no longer convincingly explain why people should live. Babylon began as a Japanese suspense thriller novel series written by Mado Nozaki and illustrated by Zane, and was later adapted into a television anime by Reveroot, airing from October 2019 to January 2020. I would like to put a little disclaimer here that I only watched the anime version, so any differences from the original work would need to be excused. Thank you for your understanding. So, an overview of the plot. The narrative follows Tensei Zaki, a public prosecutor whose investigation into illegal clinical research gradually expands into a broader political conspiracy involving the newly created Shiniki district, electoral corruption, and the legalization of self-inflicted death. At the center of this transformation stands Ai Magase, this mysterious woman who seems to have a hand in both the political shift and the deaths that surround it. Sen gradually discovers her presence through the initial pharmaceutical investigation. We first get a glance of her character when she appears as a witness and Sen interviews her to get information. But the balance of power quickly shifts during their conversation. She avoids his questions, exposes contradictions in his moral reasoning, and transforms the interview into an examination of Tsen himself. As the story progresses, Tsen uncovers that Ai has adopted different appearances and identities, but most importantly that she possesses an inexplicable ability to influence people through her words, voice, and presence. Her influence extends beyond isolated victims and reaches the very political figures connected to the Shiniki project and the movement to legalize self-inflicted death. Yet Ai should not be understood as an individual antagonist. The title Babylon already suggests that the series is working within a larger symbolic context. The title as well as the introduction both invoke Revelation 17:18, written by John of Patmos within the Book of Revelation, where Babylon appears through the image traditionally known as the whore or harlot of Babylon. Here, this figure is not just a symbol of sexual immorality. She is associated with wealth, intoxication, political complicity, violence, judgment, and the corruption of world power. The meaning of Babylon has been debated across different interpretive traditions. A common scholarly reading identifies it with Rome or Roman imperial power, while other traditions have associated it with Jerusalem and even future corrupt world order. For the purposes of this essay, what matters is the symbolic function of Babylon itself, which frames the story within a social order in which political authority, economic power, sensual temptation, and moral corruption all become inseparable. This illusion puts us in an apocalyptic frame, where Ai Magase echoes the harlot of Babylon through seduction, disorientation, and proximity to death, but it also directs our attention beyond Ai herself. If we are in the context of a systemic corruption, then Ai cannot be read only as the origin of evil. She must be read in a context of a disorder already present in the surrounding political and social order. I think without this reading, Ai's power risks appearing merely magical. She becomes a supernatural force of evil who enters the world without explanation, and her character remains a simplified translation of the Revelation image. If Aimagase is the embodiment of a broader moral disorder, then we have to ask what kind of society would make her influence possible, or even her presence possible. What kind of social world comes in parallel to the revelation sections? In his most known work, Emile Durkheim argues that ending one's life cannot be explained solely through individual psychology, private despair, or personal misfortune, as they cannot by themselves explain why its rates vary across societies, religions, communities, and historical periods. Durkheim argues that individual motives and suffering are analytically incomplete when treated in isolation. For Durkheim, ending one's life must therefore be understood as a social fact, as in being an individual act whose distribution reveals something about the moral condition of society. His analysis focuses on two dimensions of social life: integration and regulation. Integration refers to the strength of an individual's attachment to collective life, family, religion, community, work, politics, and other social bonds. Regulation refers to the moral rules, expectations, and limits through which society gives shape to desire and conduct. Together, they both determine whether individuals experience themselves as connected to others, bound by meaningful obligations, and situated within a coherent moral order. For Durkheim, human desire is not naturally self-limiting. Without social limits, aspirations can expand indefinitely, producing dissatisfaction, instability, and disorientation. Society therefore performs a necessary regulatory function. It teaches individuals what they may reasonably expect, what limits they must accept, and how to understand their place in the world. Durkheim states, "It is this relative limitation and the moderation resulting from it that makes men content with their lot, while stimulating them moderately to improve it. And it is this average contentment which gives rise to that feeling of calm, active happiness, to that pleasure in living and being, which is for societies, as for individuals, the characteristic mark of health." Durkheim argues that only social institutions can provide this regulation, and that these limitations need to be perceived as just and fair. Although Durkheim identifies several types of self-inflicted death, here I focus specifically on the anomic state because it is the most relevant to modern industrial societies. Anomie emerges when the regulatory function of social institutions weakens. Individuals lose the moral coordinates that ordinarily stabilizes desire and expectation. They no longer know what they can legitimately hope for, what they must endure, and how their suffering fits within a shared order of meaning. This has been observed in rapidly changing societies where the social frameworks that normally regulate desire and sustain meaning become unstable. In such conditions, ending one's life can appear as a symptom of a wider social disorder beyond being only an individual reaction to pain. Read through Durkheim, the mass deaths observed in Babylon become more than acts of manipulation performed by AI. They become signs of a society in which moral regulation has become weak. Durkheim's account of anomie argues that modern economic life can produce a more durable form of moral deregulation. In his study, he identifies commerce and industry as spheres in which anomie has become chronic. Economic life, once restrained by a religious authority, political power, and professional corporations, increasingly frees itself from the moral institutions that had previously limited ambition, competition, and desire. Durkheim argues that industry had ceased to be understood as a means towards a higher collective end and had instead become the supreme end of individuals and societies. In other words, economic activity no longer existed to serve society, but the other way around, as it increasingly defined society's purposes. From this context, individuals are drawn into a social world organized around expansion, ambition, competition, and future reward. The present becomes insufficient because the imagined future always promises more. Desire loses stable limits. and the real is devalued in comparison with the possible. In such a moral environment, crisis becomes especially dangerous and interruption can feel catastrophic. Economic failure, loss of status, political disappointment, or the collapse of expectation may appear not just as simple misfortune, but as existential defeat. Without a social framework capable of absorbing disappointment and giving suffering meaning, the individual can experience crisis as the collapse of the world itself. In Babylon, we are presented with a world in which medicine, business, law, and politics are already compromised by ambition and interest. The institutions that should regulate collective life appear porous, vulnerable, and ethically unstable. In this sense, the series points towards the same moral disorder Durkheim associates with modern economic life. The tension between structure and chaos become visible through Tensei Zaki being positioned as Aimagase's narrative counterpoint. I think the scenes of his domestic life reinforces this function. His family is not incidental, it marks him as someone anchored in a recognizable social order. He represents legality, family, duty, justice, an inherited moral structure. Yet, Ten's role becomes more complicated by the end. The figure who represents justice and considers human life to have great intrinsic value must act against the very values he seeks to preserve. He is a sign of the older order's remaining force. The series, I think, also asks whether these inherited structures can survive in a society already transformed by corruption, political weakness, and economic domination. The limitation of Babylon, however, is that it doesn't really fully develop the social diagnosis. Once the law is introduced, the narrative shifts quickly towards individual freedom, and although that question is philosophically important, it also displaces the sociological one. The deeper issue is not only whether self-ending can be framed as a right. I think it pushes questions on the conditions that build the perception of choice. It is how a society arrives at the point where death becomes persuasive at scale in the first place. Proponents of the law try to justify the legalization of self-inflicted death through the language of freedom, progress, autonomy, and even human evolution, while the opposition finds little language to argue for the value of life, and the political debate in this series slowly grows increasingly abstract. In doing so, they are pushed back towards the most basic moral categories, good and evil. The debate consequently forces the major economies of the world to ask whether life still possesses a shared meaning beyond individual preference. This helps explain, I think, both the mass deaths that we witness in the story, but also the characters we see throughout that start to question and ask for arguments into why they should live after experiencing their personal hardships. Here, Babylon returns us to Durkheim, where we might consider that a society governed primarily by expansion, hyper-individualism, and economic rationality may become less capable of articulating the symbolic limits that make life collectively meaningful. The introduction of the law exposes a deeper uncertainty, a weakening of the collective language through which life had previously been defended. In modern capitalistic societies, anomie does not necessarily appear as a simple absence of moral order. It is normalized through values such as flexibility, competition, ambition, and limitless achievement. Robert K. Merton develops this problem in his 1938 essay, Social Structure and Anomie. For Merton, deviance arises from a contradiction within the structure of society itself. Modern societies often promote culturally approved goals, especially success, status, material achievement, while distributing access to legitimate means unequally. The result is strain, where individuals are encouraged to pursue success, but not everyone is given realistic institutional pathways to achieve it. This reframes anomie, as here the problem is no longer only that desire lacks limits, as Durkheim defined it. It becomes tied to the gap between cultural aspirations and institutional access. and anomie expands from focusing on self-inflicted death into larger consequences on crime and deviance. Messner and Rosenfeld broadened this into a more explicitly institutional theory. In Crime and the American Dream, they argue that advanced capitalistic societies, particularly the United States, are marked by an imbalance among major social institutions. The economy becomes dominant, while non-economic institutions such as family, education, politics, community all lose some of their regulatory power. When the economy becomes culturally and institutionally dominant, economic success becomes the primary measure of worth. Education is increasingly valued for employability rather than civic formation. Family life is reorganized around work demands. Politics becomes oriented towards growth, competition, and market confidence. In this environment, non-economic institutions become less capable of regulating ambition, reinforcing obligations, or sustaining shared moral norms. Messner and Rosenfeld developed institutional anomie theory primarily to explain crime and deviance. Their argument is not about self-inflicted death in the first instance. However, if institutional imbalance can produce outward forms of deviance, it may also produce conditions in which inwardly directed violence becomes more thinkable. Self-inflicted death is a real and major social and public health problem. The series treats it as a moral and political question, while sociology asks us to examine the social conditions under which this desire becomes common at scale. If self-inflicted death is shaped not only by private despair but also by institutional weakness, then the answer cannot be limited to individual treatment or moral condemnation. As Messner and Rosenfeld also argued, it must also involve the reconstruction and strengthening of social institutions capable of sustaining life. I believe Babylon is most compelling when read not as a story of the sudden arrival of evil, but as a story about institutional failure. It imagines a world in which the institutions meant to regulate life, give it meaning, defend its value, have become corrupt. The result is a collective failure of moral order, translating in amplified helplessness, angst, and despair. Going back to John of Patmos' conclusion of his vision, he states that eventually evil turns on itself, possibly implying that corrupt systems eventually devour themselves and self-destruct. And that is worth contemplating. Thank you for listening or watching.